When a deadly winter sweeps through the frontier, a desperate young mother drags her children into an abandoned log cabin, only to discover why settlers trusted these crude structures more than anything built today. The wind was already shaking the wagon before Sarah understood what kind of night was coming. It wasn't the usual northern chill that seeped under coats and made fingers stiff. This was the kind of cold that turned breath into ice before it left the mouth, the kind that swallowed sound and made the world smaller, tighter, more dangerous with each gust, and she had no choice but to keep moving because somewhere behind her, on that white-wiped trail, was a pair of riders she prayed would lose the tracks before darkness buried them outright. She didn't know if they meant to take her wagon, her horse, or her children. She only knew that the moment she'd seen their silhouettes on the ridge, broad shapes wrapped in heavy coats, following too slowly to be friendly. Her stomach twisted in a way every frontier woman learned to trust. Her 7-year-old son, Jacob, clung to the seat beside her, his mittened hands trembling as he held onto the reins as if he could help steady the horse. Her younger daughter, May, was wrapped in blankets behind them, already half asleep, unaware of the urgency slicing through their breath. Snow blew sideways, streaking across the trail like angry white brushstrokes. Each gust rocked the wagon with the weight of a hand that didn't mean well. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, leaving behind nothing but the biting grey-blue light that came before a storm fully took ownership of the land. That was when Sarah saw it, a cabin, a shape so familiar yet so rare on these lonely stretches that for a moment she questioned whether her frightened mind had invented it. But there it stood through the blowing snow, logs stacked thick, roof pitched low, the kind of structure any modern soul might call crude or primitive, something out of a museum or postcard. Yet she felt relief so sharp it nearly brought tears, because she knew something people in this generation had long forgotten. No insulated home, no matter how modern or clever, held warmth like a true frontier log cabin, not when winter wanted blood. "Hold on," she murmured to Jacob as she snapped the reins and steered toward it. The boy didn't speak. He was too cold for words. She felt him shaking as they approached, the storm thickening so fast she could no longer see the ridge behind them. Good. Let the snow cover her tracks. Let it hide them all. The cabin's door hung slightly crooked, but the logs were tight, no gaps except where time had nudged the chinking loose. As Sarah pushed it open, she felt a wave of stale, trapped cold roll out, the kind that lived inside places left alone too long. But even with that, she knew this kind of cold was surface level. The cabin would warm quickly once a fire was started. That was how these old structures were built. Not pretty, not delicate, not polished, but thick-walled, stubborn, and unbelievably loyal to human breath and fire. She ushered the children inside, her boots thumping on the solid plank floor. The air smelled faintly of dust and old pine. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, heavy and wide, its stones hand-stacked long before she was born. If she got a flame going, even a weak one, the cabin would begin storing and reflecting heat almost immediately. Frontier families used to survive storms that would freeze livestock in their tracks, storms that ate entire settlements. And they did it in cabins exactly like this one, because these buildings were not meant to look good. They were meant to keep you alive. She stacked what wood she found and struck a match, shielding it with both hands. When it caught, the flame struggled for a moment before it breathed in and grew, orange against the blue shadows inside the room. Jacob lowered himself near the fire, holding his hands out, shaking uncontrollably. "Ma, is it safe?" he whispered. She didn't answer right away. Instinct told her the riders hadn't given up. Men who follow a woman alone in a blizzard don't stop when the light fades. They become bold in darkness. But if they reached this cabin first, they'd need to force their way in. And the door, despite its crooked hinge, was made from a slab of timber thick enough to frustrate an axe. Most modern homes couldn't boast half the resilience of a frontier cabin door. Thin, hollow, dependent on locks and latches that failed in the cold. Here, a door was as much a shield as a barrier. She checked the windows next, small, barely larger than her forearm, and set deep into the log walls. No glass, only greased cloth across one, and another covered with a wooden shutter that could be barred. Good. Large windows looked elegant in modern houses, but frontier families never had that luxury. Big windows leaked heat and invited danger. Small openings held warmth and reduced the surface area where cold and people could invade. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the children as the fire began warming the cabin's thick interior. The stone around the hearth would soon radiate heat back into the room. She pulled Jacob close, feeling the stiffness leaving his fingers. May stirred under her blanket, eyes fluttering open, as she murmured something soft. A heavy gust slammed against the cabin wall. Snow sifted through the cracks in a whisper, reminding her how thin the world outside had become. She forced herself to breathe. They'd be warmer soon. They'd be safer. The cabin walls, each log a foot thick, would hold heat long after the fire dimmed. That was something people forgot. Log cabins didn't fight winter. They outlasted it. Just as her heartbeat began to slow, something outside crunched under weight. Snow, boots, slow, deliberate. Jacob stiffened. May opened her eyes fully, sensing her mother freeze. Sarah rose from the hearth, stepping silently to the window. The storm blurred everything, but a shape moved through it. Dim, broad, undeniable. Then another. Her stomach clenched. They had followed her. The fire crackled behind her but seemed suddenly too loud, too bright, too much of a beacon. Yet they couldn't survive the night without it. She pressed her back to the wall, breath shallow, listening as the footsteps came closer. The cabin, sturdy as it was, held their weight in its silence. Jacob's hand found hers, shaking again for a different reason. Outside, the storm howled, but beneath it, she heard something worse. A man's voice, low, confident, carrying through the frozen dark, and he was calling her name. The moment she heard her name drifting through the storm, soft, drawn out, almost patient, Sarah felt something fold inside her, an old instinct rising like a ripple of pain across a scar she wished time had allowed her to forget. Jacob's grip on her hand tightened until she could feel each bone in his fingers tremble. May blinked up from the blanket pile by the fire, small face pale in the flickering glow, her confusion slowly turning to fear as she registered the silence her mother was holding so tightly. The voice came again, closer this time, more confident, a man who believed deeply in the idea that the world and the people in it still belonged to him. Sarah. She closed her eyes. She didn't want the children to hear the fear in her breath. She didn't want them to sense the memories clawing at her like broken glass under her ribs. But the past had a way of showing up in the places you'd least expect, especially out here on the frontier, where men didn't always remain buried in the lives they once lost. She moved away from the window, flattening herself against the thick log wall, listening. The logs vibrated faintly with each impact of wind outside, the structure settling under the cold. These cabins were built to flex without breaking, their interlocked corners and saddle notches designed to bow slightly under the weight of snow and wind. Modern homes creaked in storms, frontier cabins held tension like muscle, storing the force rather than fighting it. The footsteps crunched again, then stopped. Jacob swallowed audibly, eyes wide. "Ma, do they know we're in here?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The fire's glow was visible beneath the doorframe, and even through the storm's fury, the smell of burning pine carried like a banner. Anyone with half a sense could find them. "Stay where you are," she whispered, barely audible. She moved toward the door, careful not to step on the creaking spot in the floorboards she'd already discovered. The cabin was old, yes, but cabins like this aged with a kind of stubborn pride. Tight joints, thick beams, a lifetime of storms woven into the grain. But age also meant secrets, loose floorboards, drafty corners, a squeaky hinge here and there. She memorized these things in minutes. That was how people survived out here. Sarah pressed her ear to the inside of the door. Snow hissed across the wood. Wind moaned against the eaves. And just under that, breathing. Two sets, calm and deliberate. Then the man's voice again, louder this time, though softened by the blizzard. "You picked a bad night to run," Jacob whimpered. Sarah closed her hand over his mouth before the sound could carry. She didn't even look down. She just felt the boy still under her palm, felt him freeze like a hunted animal, felt his little heart hammer against his ribs. May clutched the blanket closer, eyes reflecting the fire. They didn't know who the man was. They didn't know why his voice made their mother's breath stop, and she would never let them know if there was any way to prevent it. The frontier had its share of men whose faces you pray the earth swallows before winter ends. Another voice joined the first one, younger, more impatient. "You sure she came this way?" "She always does," the older man murmured. Sarah's chest tightened. They weren't guessing. They knew. Snow slapped the door, sifted through the cracks. The cold pulsed through the wood as if the storm itself wanted inside, as if the night hungered for warmth, breath, life. The younger man spoke again. "We should break the door. End this now." "She's not armed." Sarah stared at the rifle, leaning in the corner by the hearth, empty. She had fired her last bullet earlier that afternoon, hoping to scare off a wolf circling near the trail. It had fled, but the spent round left the weapon nothing more than a piece of cold wood and metal. She had prayed she wouldn't need it again that night. The fire crackled behind her, warming the stone hearth. Already she felt the cabin changing, the logs soaking up the heat, storing it, reflecting it back, the room's temperature rising in a way that modern buildings rarely managed. Insulation filled gaps but didn't hold heat like mass did. These old cabins were built of living material, dense and slow to cool once warmed. The more Sarah breathed, the more the children breathed. The more the fire danced, the more the space became habitable, protective. In another hour, it would feel like a womb against the night outside. But an hour might be more time than they had. "Hold on," the older man said outside, tone shifting. The storm's worsening. Snow hammered the roof. Ice rattled against the shutter. Wind seeped through the keyhole like a whispering ghost. If the men forced their way inside, the storm would follow them. The warmth would be swallowed. The children, May especially, wouldn't survive long in a draft big enough to steal the fire's strength. Sarah stepped away from the door and motioned the children toward the far wall. Behind a heavy table, pushed up against the logs, Jacob guided May, both crouching low, their shadows flickering in the firelight. The hearth's glow painted them in trembling silhouettes. Sarah watched every movement with a mother's fragile terror, the kind that cracked open old wounds and old strengths all at once. The younger man outside shifted again. "Let's end this. She can't hide forever." The older man let out a slow breath. "Not tonight. Storm'll kill us before she does." That sentence filled the cabin with a strange silence. Sarah blinked. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of freezing to death. He slapped the door then. Flat hand, not a fist. A warning, a promise. "We'll be back when the sky clears," he shouted. "Don't think a borrowed cabin will save you." His boots shifted in the snow, crunching louder as he turned. The younger man cursed under his breath, but followed. Their footsteps faded into the storm, swallowed by wind, buried by snow. But fear did not leave with them. Sarah stood frozen in place for a long time, listening to the fading sound of pursuit until she could no longer separate footsteps from the storm's breathing. Her shoulders dropped only when she could no longer hear her name echoed in the wind. She returned to the children slowly, lowering herself to the floor beside them. Jacob collapsed into her side with the abrupt, shaky relief of a child who has just realized danger had passed only by inches. May touched her mother's sleeve, uncertain. "Ma, who were they?" Jacob whispered. She stared into the fire. "They're men I hoped we'd never cross paths with again." It was not a lie, but she could not give them the truth. How she'd once trusted the older one, how she'd believed his promises, how she'd learned too late that some men had a way of owning things they never deserved, and how some debts on the frontier never truly stayed buried under snow. The fire brightened, snapping loudly as a log split. The heat pressed back the room's chill further. The stone hearth radiated warmth into the log walls, storing it like a battery forged from earth itself. The children inched closer, letting that warmth wrap around their hands and faces, the frost melting from their clothes. Jacob leaned his head on her shoulder, eyes half closed. May curled into the blankets again, clutching her mother's skirt. Sarah kept her gaze on the fire, but her ears on the storm. The log walls groaned faintly under a gust, but held strong, thick, interlocked, immovable. A modern house, framed in thin lumber and cheap insulation, would tremble under this kind of pressure. Pipes would freeze, windows would rattle, but a true log cabin, built with care and sweat and stubborn hands, became a fortress in the cold, every seam packed tight with earth and moss and clay, every corner locked in place with geometry as old as frontier instinct. She felt the warmth beginning to seep into her bones, loosening the numbness in her toes. The children had stopped shaking. The cabin had claimed them, wrapped them, protected them in a way few places in the world still could, but she knew she didn't have long. When the storm cleared, those men would return, and the cabin's strength, as mighty as it was, couldn't shield them from everything that lived out there in men's hearts. Sarah reached for the fire poker, stirring the embers, watching sparks dance upward like tiny fleeting souls. She rebuilt the flame slowly, stacking logs just so, the glow growing bigger, brighter, warmer. Every bit of heat now mattered. Every degree the cabin gained tonight was one more advantage before morning. But when she turned away from the fire, she noticed something she'd missed earlier. A second door, barely visible, set low in the floorboards, covered by a slab of timber that blended into the planks. A hidden hatch. Her breath stopped. Jacob noticed her staring and followed her gaze. "Ma," he whispered. Sarah rose, walked toward the hatch, knelt, and brushed away the dust. There were scratch marks near the edge, fresh ones. Someone had opened it recently, and not long before they arrived. For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. She simply knelt there, fingers hovering above the hatch as the fire cracked behind her, and the storm battered the logs like a giant trying to shake the world apart. She didn't even blink. It felt as if her body had gone perfectly numb, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that they had not stumbled into an abandoned cabin at all. Someone had been inside, maybe still was. She pressed her palm against the wood, feeling for warmth. Frontier instincts were like second nature. She could read heat, draft, grain. The plank was cold on the surface, but beneath that cold, she sensed a faint echo of disturbance. Not warmth exactly, but lack of deep freeze. A board untouched for months felt like a tombstone, icy through and through, stiff with neglect. This hatch, however, held the subtle softness of recent movement. Jacob's voice was a whisper behind her. "Ma, who uses a door in the floor?" Her eyes stayed on the hatch. "People who don't want to be found." He swallowed hard, understanding too much for his age. The firelight flickered across May's face as she clutched the blankets tighter around herself, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that came when a child sensed her mother's dread and didn't need it explained. Sarah ran her fingers along the scratch marks again. They weren't old. The edges of the wood splinters were still light, not yet darkened by time or smoke or dust. Someone had dug their nails here, or used a knife, or tugged up the plank with frantic haste, and whoever it was, they didn't close it gently. She felt it now, the tiniest sliver of cold seeping from the edge. Not enough to chill the room, not enough to be noticeable unless kneeling right next to it, but still there. A draft so thin it might as well have been the breath of something hiding below. The cabin didn't creak the way modern houses did when the temperature shifted. These logs, seasoned through decades, accepted cold and heat like a living thing. But the floorboards above the hatch were different. One was bowed, slightly, as if weight had pressed it down recently. She didn't lift the hatch outright. Frontier logic meant caution first, curiosity second. Instead, she stood slowly and scanned the rest of the cabin, trying to see it not as a desperate mother seeking shelter, but as whoever had built it, lived in it, used it last. Frontier homes didn't waste space. People built additions only when needed. A hidden compartment suggested secrets. Secrets always meant trouble. Sarah turned toward the shuttered window, trying to measure how much of the night had passed. The storm was heavier now, wind curling around the corners of the structure like fingers. Snow slammed against the logs in thick sheets, building drifts that would soon reach the lower sill. The doorframe rattled once before settling again. The cabin felt smaller with each gust, but also warmer, safer. The fire was strong now, the stones glowing, the logs crackling as the heat seeped into the walls. By now the entire structure held warmth like a deep-bellied oven. Modern homes with fiberglass insulation cooled the second the power went out, but a log cabin, heated for an hour, could hold warmth through an entire night, slowing its release the way a living being held breath in winter. But warmth meant little if danger already lived under their feet. Sarah stepped back toward the hearth and grabbed the poker. It wasn't a weapon, too heavy, too short, but she gripped it anyway. Fear sharpened everything inside her. "Jacob," she whispered, "take your sister. Sit behind the table again. Stay low." He didn't argue. The boy's hands trembled as he guided May back into their corner, curling himself around her like a small shield. His eyes remained locked on his mother, full of silent pleading. Sarah knelt once more and put her fingertips under the hatch's corner. It lifted, not much, not loudly, but enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beneath. Then she froze, because she heard it, a breath. Not wind, not storm, human, a single, trembling inhale from below. She let the hatch fall shut without a sound. Her heart slammed against her ribcage so hard she thought Jacob might hear it. The fire's crackle suddenly felt too loud, too alive, almost dangerous in its brightness. She slowly backed away from the hatch, keeping her eyes fixed on it, as if expecting the plank to erupt upward. Someone was under the cabin, someone hiding, someone afraid, or someone waiting. A dozen possibilities flashed through her mind, none of them comforting. Settlers sometimes dug shallow root cellars beneath cabins, spaces used to store potatoes, onions, salted meat. Some dug small hiding pits if they lived near disputed lands. But this hatch, this one didn't lead to storage. The draft was too strong, the darkness too deep. A small, underground room, maybe. Big enough for a person, two, even. Sarah backed up until her shoulders touched the cold logs of the wall. Her breath trembled. The storm outside swallowed all other sound now, the howl so constant it felt like a pressure inside her ears. Jacob whispered, "Ma, what's down there?" Her eyes stayed on the hatch. "I don't know." But she did know one thing. Whoever hid below must have heard them, must have heard her children's voices, must have heard every word spoken since they entered, which meant silence wasn't safety anymore. The storm raged harder, wind weaving itself through the cabin's joints, making the room vibrate faintly. The warmth from the fire built in deep waves against the cold outside, fighting with quiet determination, the walls sweating slightly with the shift in temperature. Above them, snow packed onto the roof, but the cabin's design let it accumulate safely, the low pitch letting weight settle without lifting shingles or threatening collapse. Everything felt like a trap now. The cabin gave them shelter from the storm, but could also trap them with a stranger beneath their feet and two determined men somewhere beyond the white curtain of the blizzard. Sarah forced herself to breathe, slow, steady, controlled. The old man outside had said he'd return when the sky cleared. But what if the man hiding below came out first? Her pulse hammered like a fist in her throat. She moved slowly toward the corner where the children hid and lowered herself down between them, wrapping her arms around them, the firelight warming their faces. She had no weapon, no ammunition, no way out until the storm passed, and she was trapped between threats, above and below. The fire dimmed slightly, settling as it reached a steady burn. Shadows danced across the walls. The cabin's interior glowed gold against the blue-gray storm, pressing against the tiny window. Then a sound, soft, slow, the unmistakable noise of a plank shifting. The hatch. Sarah didn't breathe. Jacob's nails dug into her arm. May whimpered into her mother's chest. The board lifted an inch, then another. A pair of fingers, thin, shaking, gripped the edge of the hatch. Not large fingers, not the fingers of a violent man. They trembled as if exhausted, or freezing, or injured. Sarah tightened her hold on the poker, but then she heard a voice from below, weak, cracked, barely a thread of breath. Please, don't scream." Her heart jolted. The voice was small, young, feminine, not a man at all. "Help me," the girl whispered. "Please." Jacob looked up at Sarah, confusion and fear mixing in his wide eyes. "Ma, is she hurt?" Sarah didn't answer. She watched as the hatch slowly lifted, inch by inch, revealing a pale face below, dirt-streaked, shivering, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken but alive with desperation. A girl no older than 16, wrapped in a torn shawl, lips blue with cold. She blinked at the firelight as if seeing warmth for the first time in days. The storm roared, the logs hummed with tension, the children clung to their mother, and the girl beneath the cabin whispered with a throat dry as ash, "They're coming back for me." Her gaze shifted toward the door. "The same men looking for you." The hatch creaked upward another inch, the girl's trembling fingers gripping its underside as if she feared her strength might give out at any second. When her face rose fully into view, skin gray with cold, lips split and bleeding, long hair plastered to her cheeks, Sarah felt something twist inside her. Fear, yes, but also recognition. Not recognition of the girl herself, but of the look she carried. That hollow, hunted stare. That silent request for mercy from someone who had no reason left to trust the world. It was the look of someone who had been running far longer than Sarah had. The fire's glow painted the girl's face in thin orange strokes. The warmth did not reach her eyes yet. They stayed wide, staring past Sarah toward the shuttered window, toward the storm that had devoured the entire horizon beyond the cabin walls. Her voice cracked again, weak, brittle as the ice on the windowsill. "They'll come back," she whispered. "When the storm breaks, they'll come." Jacob pressed himself closer to Sarah, one arm wrapped protectively around May's shoulders. Both children stared at the girl, as though she had risen from the floor not by climbing but by haunting. Sarah felt their breaths against her side, quick and shallow. They looked to her for answers, for protection, for clarity she did not have, and still she moved toward the girl. "Slowly," Sarah murmured. "Come up slowly." The girl obeyed, dragging herself halfway through the hatch. Her hands trembled violently as she used the floor to push herself upward. She was exhausted, her body shaking not only from cold but starvation, fear, and whatever torment had driven her into the hidden pit beneath the cabin. Her foot caught on something below, a box maybe, or uneven earth, and she winced sharply, letting out a faint cry. Sarah reached toward her instinctively, helping lift her weight to the floor. The girl flinched at the touch, recoiling as though expecting pain, but Sarah didn't pull away. She steadied her until the girl's knees rested fully on the boards. Jacob whispered, "Ma, is she bad?" Sarah shook her head. "She's half frozen." The girl blinked toward the fire, as if unsure whether she was allowed to approach it. Sarah motioned her forward. The girl crawled the last few feet, collapsing so close to the hearth that the heat made steam rise from her clothes. She held her hands out toward the flames, but not fully, like someone taught that warmth was something borrowed, not owned. Her hands were bruised, her wrists too thin, her nails broken. Sarah's heart clenched. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. The girl hesitated. Her voice was barely audible. "Lydia." May peeked from behind Jacob's shoulder. "Why were you under the floor?" Lydia swallowed, throat dry. Her voice cracked. "Because I ran before they could drag me back." The room fell into a stunned silence. Outside, the storm beat against the walls with the force of 1,000 fists, but inside it felt eerily still, as though the cabin itself were listening. Sarah crouched nearer. "Those men, did they hurt you?" Lydia didn't nod. She didn't need to. Pain lived in the shape of her shoulders, the way she sat as if bracing for someone to grab her at any moment. The cabin's thick logs protected her from the storm, but her memories were a colder blizzard than the one outside. Jacob wrapped both arms around May, pulling her down behind the table again. Sarah could see the fear building in him, the kind that stretched a boy thin between wanting to hide and wanting to protect. Lydia's eyes fixed on Sarah with sudden urgency. "You have to leave," she whispered. "When the storm calms, when the wind quiets, they'll return. They never stop. They don't care how cold it gets." Sarah's blood chilled. Lydia continued, voice trembling. "They used this cabin, that hatch. They kept me down there when winter came. They said nobody would hear me scream under the floor. And they were right." Jacob gasped softly. May buried her face in his coat. Sarah felt fire crawl under her skin. Not the warmth from the hearth, but anger. Frontier anger. The kind that sharpened judgment and steadied hands. She looked at the hatch again. It lay open, its darkness yawning. Now she understood the scratches, the frantic marks. Lydia had clawed her way out when she heard Sarah's voice. If Sarah hadn't arrived when she did, Lydia wouldn't have lived through another night. Sarah swallowed hard. "How long were you down there?" "A week," Lydia whispered. "Maybe longer. I lost track. They came only to check if I was still breathing." Sarah clenched her jaw until it hurt. Behind her, the cabin walls moaned under another gust. Snow hit the logs with such force it sounded almost like fists. But old cabins didn't budge. The interlocked corners and thick logs absorbed the impact, storing the storm's rage while shielding those inside. Lydia's eyes drifted toward the door. "They used to come when storms cleared. That's when they took women, when roads were buried and nobody could follow." The way she said women made Sarah's stomach twist. She closed the hatch fully, sliding the plank back into place. The board thumped softly, solid, final, as though burying something unspeakable. Sarah turned to the girl again. "You're safe for now. The storm will hold them off." "No," Lydia whispered, shaking her head violently. "It won't. They always come back." Sarah stood. Her fear had shifted into something else, something harder, something anchored deep inside her bones. She walked to the tiny window, brushing aside the ragged cloth, peeking into the blizzard. The wind was still raging, but there, barely visible, shadows moved between swirls of white. Not 2, 3, maybe 4. Sarah's breath faltered. They were early. The storm wasn't even finished, and yet they were out there, trudging through waist-deep snow, determined, methodical, shaped like ghosts forged from hunger and cruelty. Jacob whimpered. May clung tighter. Lydia's voice cracked. "See, I told you. They don't stop." Sarah closed the shutter. She turned back to the room, the firelight, the children, the trembling girl. 4 lives looked back at her, each depending on her judgment, each depending on this cabin to shield them. Frontier cabins had withstood avalanches, wolves, sieges, blizzards. They were built for survival, not beauty. And she felt now, more than ever, the weight of what that meant. If she was going to protect these children, and Lydia, she would have to use the cabin exactly as it was meant to be used. Not as a house, as a fortress. Sarah moved quickly. She dragged the heavy table toward the door, wedging it tightly. The legs dug into the plank floor with a scraping grind that echoed through the small room. Lydia flinched but didn't speak. Jacob hurried to help, pushing with all his weight. "Ma?" Jacob whispered. "What if they break in?" "They won't," Sarah said, though her voice shook slightly. "These walls will hold," and she prayed she was right. She grabbed every pot, pan, log, and piece of furniture, building barricades, reinforcing the door, plugging drafts. Sweat rolled down her back despite the cold. The storm was losing strength now, bit by bit. She could hear it, the howl softening, the gusts shorter. That meant the men outside would gather soon, waiting for the moment the wind dipped far enough for them to begin breaking down the door. Lydia forced herself forward, voice desperate. "They get inside everything. They can wait outside all night. You don't know them?" Sarah knelt in front of her. "No. But I've known men like them." Lydia's eyes searched hers. "Then you know they'll kill us before sunrise?" Sarah touched her shoulder gently. "Not if the storm kills them first." Lydia blinked. "What?" Sarah stood again, the cabin's warmth shimmering around her like a heartbeat. These walls, thick, dense, built to trap heat, were not like modern houses. They could withstand cold long enough for someone inside to survive the kind of gamble nobody in a modern, insulated home would dare attempt. "You're going to stay by the fire," Sarah whispered. "Keep warm, keep breathing." Jacob stared at her, confused. "Ma, what are you going to do?" Sarah walked to the door and blew out the lantern nearest it, dimming the cabin's glow. "I'm going to use the cold," she said softly. The storm outside groaned. "You 3 stay alive in the warmth." A thump hit the outside of the cabin wall, hard. The children froze. Lydia let out a strangled gasp. Another thump followed. A boot, a fist. The men had reached the cabin fully now, silhouettes shifting outside like wolves circling prey. Sarah closed her eyes. The heat of the cabin pulsed around her. The outside world, however, was death, absolute and immediate. The difference between inside and outside was staggering. Already the windows were frosting from the contrast. She whispered to the children, "This cabin will keep you alive. I will keep them outside." A voice outside shouted her name, angrier this time. Then came a blow against the door so powerful it made the logs vibrate. Jacob clung to Lydia. May buried her face in Jacob's coat. Sarah reached down, tightened the last brace against the door, and whispered to herself, "These walls stood before them. They'll stand after." Another blow, another, each weaker, each followed by gasps from outside. Not hers, theirs. She heard it clearly through the log walls now, the sharp, desperate inhalations of men freezing faster than they expected, men whose bodies were losing strength in minutes, not hours, because the storm's dying winds exposed the truth. They had underestimated the cold, and the cabin was saving only one side of the door. Minutes passed, then silence, deep, terrifying silence. Sarah waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing. When she finally cracked open the shutter, dawn's faint blue light revealed the truth. The storm had broken, and 4 shapes lay half buried in the snow, still, frozen, unmoving. The cold had claimed them where rage could not. She didn't open the door until the sun rose fully, warming the world enough so her children wouldn't see death in its sharpest form. When she stepped outside, the cabin exhaled behind her. Warm air meeting cold, steam rising like a breath of thanks from the logs. Old cabins survived winter because they were built with thick walls and thicker resolve, and sometimes they saved not only those who hid within their warmth, but those who refused to let danger cross their threshold. Sarah returned inside, shutting the door gently. Jacob, May, and Lydia stared at her with trembling relief. The cabin, holding its warmth like a miracle, felt alive around them. "You're safe now," Sarah whispered, and for the first time all night, she believed it.